Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to join me this evening. It's lovely to see all of you. For those of you in the back, if you want to move a bit further forward, I promise I don't bite. But if you want to stay where you are, that's wonderful. So first I'd like to thank the organisers for asking me here. I'd heard so many good things about Ropecon from other people that I've worked with and I'm friends with who'd been here as guests before. So I was delighted when I received the invitation. It's one of those funny things. Apparently, the organisers were thinking of me as a replacement guest, and one of them was thinking, hang on, she looks vaguely familiar. Why do I know her? And then they looked at Facebook, and they're actually friends with my husband, Richard, who does a lot of international LARPs, so who knows quite a lot of Finnish gamers, because he's been at various things, including Odysseus a couple of weeks ago, and he's never shut up about it since he came home. So I was very happy to get the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for asking me. So what we're going to do is I'll give you a bit of an introduction about me, but I also want to hear from you. So we have the wonderful Cube microphone, which I won't throw at people because I'm a terrible shot, and I'll only miss. So as I'm going through, if you do have a question, let me know, and I'll come and give you the microphone. And upset the people who were streaming this because I'm going to be wandering around all over the place and waving my hands everywhere. So that you can ask any questions as they occur to you, rather than waiting to the end and then you've forgotten what it was you wanted to ask me in the first place, okay? Is everybody happy with that? Now this really takes me back. I used to be a college lecturer and I packed that in as a bad job about 8 years ago now. So this is really strange being back in what looks very much like a lecture theatre, standing here with a microphone and a table and everything. I do apologise, I don't have any pretty slides to show you like John did, because it never dawned on me that I'd be able to show you slides, because a lot of the conventions I go to don't have the facilities. It's also something I tend to associate with my other job, because I give talks on historical embroidery techniques, and that's the thing that needs the pictures. Because there's only so many samples a woman can sew between talks. And they're quite heavy to look around. And they're not necessarily always that historically accurate. So it's nice to have a presentation. So I'm afraid it's just me. That's it. Hopefully the top is visually pleasing enough. So, gaming. Oh, well, I've had a very varied career. I didn't actually start gaming until I went to university, which, believe it or not, will be 30 years in October. I was aware of gaming, not necessarily in the most positive light, although my first sort of encounter with it was when I went to the pictures to see E.T. when it came out at the cinema, so that's a very long time ago. Unfortunately, I had flu, and my friend insisted I still had to go, so my memories of E.T. are very vague, and I've never actually seen it since. So I was always kind of like, did I see them doing Dungeons and Dragons in there, or was I just hallucinating that? I am reliably informed that they are actually playing Dungeons and Dragons in there. And then there's a murder mystery series. I was raised on murder mysteries. My mum loves them, so I was raised watching Columbo and Agatha Christie and you name it. And there was a very famous Scottish show called Taggart, which starred pretty much every single Scottish actor ever, apart from David Tennant. As far as I'm aware. I may be wrong. And they did one, and it was about LARPers. And let's just say it wasn't a particularly positive portrayal, because it was about a guy dressing up in a big cloak with a big sword, running around sewers, killing people. So, you know, slightly strange vibes going on there. Because this was the late 80s. So, you know, people did have some funny ideas about what we got up to. Not necessarily all of them wrong, but some of them. So I went off to university, never really thinking about gaming or that I would get into it. Now, I went to Newcastle University. My family were all from the northeast, but I was born and raised in Nottinghamshire because my dad had to move there for work. And I was keen to get out of there. It's a very pretty part of the world. We're very blessed because it's what's called the Dukeries. And that was where all the landed gentry had their gigantic country estates. So when you see Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice, That's the kind of thing I grew up near. All the big stately homes, all the big estates. In fact, several of the estates near where I grew up were actually used for the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. Chatsworth in particular. So I used to swim in the river at Chatsworth when I was a child. So it's always fun when you see these things on screen. Not the pond, though. That was somewhere else. So I didn't have a Darcy moment at any point in time, for those of you who've seen it. So I went up to Newcastle to university. The hall of residence I was in was the wonderfully named Ethel Williams Hall. And it was a real mishmash of buildings. So there was an old vicarage, which was where my first room was. There was a really old bit of the building which nobody was quite sure what it was. And then there was lots of modern bits. There was 1920s bit, front entrance. And it had been a nursing home. It had been all sorts of different things. And it was now a hall of residence, which was 3 miles out of the centre of Newcastle and a long way away from the main university campus. Named after the first woman to graduate in medicine at Newcastle University. And there was a gigantic portrait of Ethel in the dining hall. Terrifying woman. Watching every meal. But very important woman. And because it was so far out, we had our own bar. And they did a lot of stuff during Freshers' Week because the public transport didn't run very late. And it was a long walk back from the centre of town if you stayed out very late, or very expensive taxis. So we had our own bar, like I said, and they did parties. So the first night, I turned up to the party in my Seattle Seahawks football shirt. Because at that time, American football was very big in Britain. And it was on Sunday afternoons around tea time, and me and my dad used to watch that when Ski Sunday wasn't on, which was also a British institution on Sunday tea times, watching winter sports. And I just put it on because it was really hot, and I was very proud of it because Seattle Seahawks was actually quite a difficult one to get hold of. You could get the Dolphins, you could get the Raiders, you could get all the sort of main teams, but I liked the Seahawks one, mostly because I liked the design and the colour, to be fair to start with, but then supported the team because of their excellent design choices. And I turned up to the first night party, and then this group of young men approached me. And they said, "Oh, do you like American football then?" I said, "Oh, yes." So we started to get into a conversation about that. And it turned out several of them were actually on Newcastle University's American football team. And we had a good chat. And then it turned out they were gamers. And I thought, oh, hello, here's an opportunity. And they invited me to join their gaming group. They were second-year students. Now, the way that things used to work back then at British universities is, if you were lucky, you would spend your first year in a hall of residence, and then you would all get a house, and you would move out. This lot, bless them, had figured out that it was actually far cheaper to stay in the hall of residence, where you got your breakfast and your dinner during the week, and your breakfast and your lunch at weekends. You didn't have to worry about bills, and it was always nice and warm, and you were taken care of. And they had a few rooms set aside for people like that, plus the fact none of them could cook to save their lives, and it was much better that they were, somewhere where they were going to get fed. And they invited me along. And the first game I played was actually RuneQuest, and I inherited Shirley the Dwarf. She was someone else's character, and my GM, John Wilson, I blame him for a lot of things, particularly the reason I'm here today, because he was, my first GM, my first keeper. And he was mostly running RuneQuest from memory, because he'd run it at school, but somebody had stolen all of his rule books. But he had a few character sheets left over, and I got Shirley. She had a sex change. Apparently she was a man to start with. And she had a gigantic wolfhound that she used to ride. So I loved playing Shirley. But very shortly after I started playing, and I was very lucky with the group that I had, because everybody bar one person was also a GM. So we got to try lots of different games, because people would take turns. And there was one guy who was a player, and he was very happy with that. But shortly after I started, they said, "Oh no, you're going to start GMing. We haven't played Red Box D&D in ages. Here you go, you're doing it." So that was within about a month, if that, of me starting gaming. And I loved it. D&D Red Box was a great deal of fun, but more for them than it was for me, because they knew it backwards. They knew it inside out, because they'd been doing it since they were young. And I thought, no, I'm not enjoying this as much as I should be. So I flicked through magazines, and those of you who were old enough to remember the advert for Talaslanta, no elves. Okay, let's give this a go. This looks interesting. I like the artwork. So I got it. I mail-ordered it, which was a lot harder 30 years ago than it is now. And I loved it instantly. It was brilliant. So that became my game, and I started running that. And I knew I was doing something right when we did a big campaign, and at the end of it, their character's mentor died. He took them back to his home to show them where he'd come from and where it had all started, and then he just quietly slipped away. And I got into so much trouble from them, the players, because I hadn't warned them this was happening, and they didn't feel that I'd given them the chance to say goodbye to him properly. And I thought, I'm doing something right then. If they're that invested, yay, I really enjoy this. This is good stuff. Really funny, at the end of my first year, I went home and I met it with people that I'd done my A-levels with, which is the qualifications that you do in Britain from 16 to 18. And it turns out that the people that I'd done most of my A-levels with, it was a very small group because it was a local school. There were only 1,000 pupils in the entire school altogether, and only about 50 people in the sixth form. So there were 4 guys that I'd done pretty much all of my A-levels with. They were all gamers. They just never told me because they weren't sure whether it was something I'd be interested in. And I've got no idea whether that was because I was a woman or whether it was because they genuinely had no idea that was the sort of thing I would be interested in. So it was a slight missed opportunity, but then again, I was introduced to gaming by a wonderful group. And because we all stayed in the Hall of Residence, because I agreed it was a lot easier to just stay there and have other people cook my dinners for me, that every year when the new first years came in, we got new players. And then as people graduated, we were still getting fresh players in. So again, it was wonderful because we got to try so many different things. Although the funniest moment was definitely when one of the newer joiners got out Shadowrun. And a room full of 8 gamers did not have enough D6s to roll the damage for a dragon. Now that takes some doing. So that was a lot of fun. We used to play Call of Cthulhu as light relief from the campaign games, believe it or not. And the really funny thing is that because of that, I haven't played most of the big campaigns that are iconic, which in some ways is slightly embarrassing when people ask me about them, but it's also quite good from the standpoint that now we're updating them to 7th edition, I can come up to them completely fresh, with no rose-tinted spectacles, we say at home, no prior expectations tinged by enjoyment of someone having run them for me. And that's sometimes quite an important thing to do. We'll come on to Master Nyarlathotep about that later. So my gaming life at university was very rich as an undergraduate. And in the last year of my degree, which was biochemistry, we got a new subwarden. Now, the Hall of Residence had subwardens, so they were postgraduate students. They had a flat, individual flats in different parts of the building, and basically our job was to stand on the desk so the porters could have a break, and then patrol the building at midnight to make sure the students were behaving themselves, because I later became a subwarden. One of the other wonderful things about that hall was it was over the railway line to a very rough council estate. And when there were riots one summer, and at various different points, they had people sort of trying to break in. And there used to be a nightclub down the road, and that used to cause problems as well. So under the front desk, there was a sawn-off pool cue, about 2.5, 3 feet of copper pipe with the end bent over full of sand, and 2 foot of lead piping in case of trouble. So it was a wonderful hall of residence and a really lovely place, but it was always very comforting to know that you had an assorted array of weaponry should the locals get restive. So anyway, that's what the subwardens did. So Simon turned up as subwarden, and he did something else. He did LARPing. He'd come over from Durham University, 3rd oldest university in Britain after Oxford and Cambridge. So many castles in England, we let the students live in them. Durham Castle is actually University College Durham. It's a hall of residence. Really great, really interesting, apart from the fact that it's over the green from the cathedral, so all night you get woken up by the cathedral bells. Not so good. And Durham University has Treasure Trap, which I think the Durham branch is the oldest continuously running LARPing society in Britain now. It's been going for it's about 35, 40 years or something. So Simon came over, and he was running Werewolf, and he started taking some of us over to Durham to do the LARPing. So I thought, let's give this a go. Should be good fun. Nobody knows me there, so I can dress up like a lunatic, and no one in Newcastle is going to know. Newcastle did have its own live role-playing society called Fools and Heroes, which was a different system, but they used to meet in Jesmond at midnight on a Saturday night, which is this beautiful park in the middle of Newcastle. I was at that point terrified of the dark, so there was absolutely no way on earth you were getting me out in a forest at night with people I didn't really know running around. Not happening. So Treasure Trap took place mostly during the day, so that was fine. I could do that. So my first character for live role-playing was a blue elf, until I discovered that face paint and me don't get on. So that kind of didn't last very long. So we were doing tabletop gaming in Newcastle, live role-playing in Durham. And that's actually where I met my husband, because he was in the Treasure Trap as well, because he was at Durham University. And there's a bit of rivalry between Durham and Newcastle, because Newcastle used to be Armstrong College, Durham. And then it broke away and became its own thing. So there's this little bit of tension between the two. So I was starting to do both and really enjoying myself. Only Treasure Trap has quite a complicated way of working out your hit points. So I was used to cheat. If somebody hit me, I fell over, because it was easier than having to try and work out how many hits I still had left. Also meant I tended to survive more fights, because most people, once you're on the floor, stop hitting you. There are some sneaky blighters who figured this out and used to come and hit me again, and then I used to kick them gently. But, you know, so that was my introduction to LARPing and my husband, and we've been married for 21 years now in April. So, you know, gaming has brought me many, many wonderful friends and a really cute husband as well. So, around the time I was finishing off my degree and starting my PhD, still at Newcastle, I was supposed to go somewhere else, but the funding fell through. But I was quite happy to stay in Newcastle because I loved it. And Wizards of the Coast had bought Talisanta, and they were bringing out new scenario books. And I got them, and I thought, well, those are okay. But being very arrogant and young, you know how you are in your early 20s, and you think you know it all. I thought, no, I could do this. I can do better than that. I used to win prizes at school for English. Let's do this. So I just sent off some of my scenarios to Wizards of the Coast by post. And I sent myself a copy as well with a date on, because that was the thing you had to do to make sure, you know, you had a record of when you sent it. And then I got back from university one day, and there was a message at the desk, and they said, some Americans rang for you. Slightly suspiciously. It's like, why are Americans ringing? With a number like, please ring back. So I tried from the hall phones, but they ate money like nobody's business. You know, back in the day when you had to put coins in a phone. And it was like 30 seconds and gone, obviously because I'm ringing America. And they said, well, don't you know, go and find a phone you can actually do a collect call from. We will pay for it. This is ridiculous. So my first real conversation with the people who ran Wizards of the Coast back then was standing in a phone box at a set of traffic lights in the pouring rain, chatting away. And they invited me to Euro Gen Con, the late lamented. Now, Euro Gen Con took place in a British holiday camp in November on the south coast. It was freezing, always freezing, and it was quite entertaining to get to as well because it was in the middle of nowhere. Funnily enough, I'd actually stayed in the holiday camp next door as a child with my parents, so I actually knew where it was and how to get to it. And the thing about a lot of British conventions like that is that you get this real sort of shared family mentality because you're stuck there. There is absolutely nowhere else for you to go, and it builds this real sense of camaraderie. So I turned up just after they'd launched Magic the Gathering, and it had all gone, absolutely crazy for them. So they'd gone from eating baked beans out of a tin and wondering where the rent was going to come from to millionaires, basically, in a very short space of time. And they were wonderful. I had a really good time. And that's when I met Lisa Stevens, and I think Eric Mona as well, although I doubt they remember that at all. So, did that for a couple of years, that was great. And then they invited me to go to Gen Con to run a demonstration game of Talislanta. And they had that much money in those days, they could do stupid things like that. Yeah, come over. Come over to, where was it? It's the original place it was in. My mind has just died. Anyway, Milwaukee, that was it. It was in Milwaukee. Come over to Milwaukee. And that was when they'd got Nightfall Games. So we all went over on the plane. Fabulous bunch of guys, the Nightfall Games lot. And I used to play what we call hooky from my PhD. So I used to just leave the PhD and go off to Glasgow and do stuff for Nightfall Games at a weekend and then come back and try and do science. Not necessarily successfully. As any scientist in the room knows, it usually doesn't work, and occasionally it will, by accident. So I went off to there, Gen Con, that was amazing, I'd done it, because that was kind of the pinnacle, you get to go to Gen Con. And Wizards of the Coast never published anything I wrote, apart from for Slay Industries. And that was my first writing thing, was doing bits for Slay Industries. And the Mort source book was the first published work. Now, when I was at UK Games Expo a couple of months ago, I bumped into Jared Earle, who's one of the co-owners of Nightfall Games. I hadn't seen him in 20-odd years. And we sat down and chatted, and it was just, wonderful being back with an old friend. And I was telling him that I still had a photocopy of the first cheque that they ever sent me for the work I did for Nightfall Games. And it was also really interesting because as midnight came around, they made me stay up till midnight for a very specific reason, because it was the 30th of May? 31st. Last day of May, anyway. And of course, on the 1st of May, I officially became full-time, 1st of June, I officially became full-time at Chaosium. So I was sitting between my first employer in the gaming industry and my current employer, next employer in the gaming industry, as midnight rolled round. And we all thought there was a certain degree of symmetry to that that was really quite nice. So I was writing bits and bobs while I was doing my PhD, got my PhD, toddled off to Canada for a year, because biomedical sciences, the thing is that, North America, it's the land of milk and honey for research science. Didn't really want to go to actual America, kind of fancied Canada instead. Partly because, by that point, I'd had many, many arguments with Robin Laws on various chat rooms and newsgroup things about the redevelopment of Talislanta that he was then in charge of. I didn't agree with most of what he was going to do, and I told him so. And we used to have some really good banter about that. And I was offered a job in Toronto, and I knew Robin lived there, so I said, what's it like? Is it okay? He went, yeah, come on, over you come. So I was due to be there for 2 years. Toronto is a wonderful city, or it certainly was 20-odd years ago. I haven't been back for a while. The job was awful, hated it. But living there was great, and I got to be in Robin's gaming group, so I got to play a lot of stuff, very interesting things, got to meet a lot of lovely people. And him and his wife, Val, kind of looked after me while I was there, and that's when I really started to develop more industry links and get involved in doing more actually in the industry, because we started playtesting things that Robin was writing, even when I came back. When I came back from Canada, I ended up in Salisbury, which is a tiny little cathedral city. Now, the wonderful thing about British cities is it doesn't matter how big they are to be a city. All you need is a cathedral. If you have a cathedral, you are a city. So Durham's not very big, but that's a city because it's got a cathedral. And you've all seen Durham Cathedral, because it was it's Hogwarts in the early Harry Potter films, and most recently it was Asgard in Endgame. So those beautiful big columns behind Thor when he's talking to his mum, that's our cathedral. It's beautiful, really solid Norman architecture, stamping their authority on the restive natives. Wonderful building. So Salisbury has a cathedral, so it's a city. But it's even smaller than Durham. St David's is the smallest city. I think there's only about 30 people live there. But it's a really ancient cathedral, so therefore it's a city. So I go down to Salisbury, and at that point in time, you could go bowling on a Sunday, you could go to the pictures, or you could go to the supermarket, and that was it, because we didn't have Sunday opening, or you could game. So I joined the local gaming group for a bit. And that did lead to one of the strangest experiences I'd ever had in gaming, because it's next to Salisbury Plain, which is a huge military base. And I wasn't really used to playing with people who were sort of like gung-ho, fighty, it's all about the weapons and acquisition of stuff. And because several of them were soldiers, they were very fighty acquisition of stuff gamers, which was really strange. It was also one poor guy, he obviously had PTSD and needed help, and decided I was a sympathetic person. And I opened my door one day and he's standing there. I hadn't told him where I lived. He'd found me, which was slightly alarming, and I was the only person in the house at the time. So I talked to him and then found an excuse to get out. I mean, it was very sweet that he thought I was someone he could confide in, but really alarming when somebody tracks you down in that manner. So that's my weirdest gaming experience, I would say. So after Salisbury, in the middle of which I got married, when we were living at opposite ends of the country, we didn't actually get to live together until 6 months after we got married because of our work. We finally managed to get that together. And by this time, I'm doing more gaming stuff, play testing things, getting more involved. And largely for Pelgrane Press by that point in time, because that's who were publishing a lot of Robin stuff. So I did a lot of stuff for Dying Earth, which was a huge amount of fun, because you can be silly as anything with that game. So we were play testing it, I was writing things for it. So I wrote a lot of stuff for the excellent Prismatic Spray, which was the magazine come sort of scenario supplement book that came out at regular intervals. So that's really where I learnt my craft in terms of writing. So that's, there's a huge amount of stuff there that I did. But then I started doing other bits and bobs. But then I kind of ended up walking away a bit from tabletop gaming because our group fell apart. Because half of it had a family, and one of the people in that partnership decided that they weren't really into gaming anymore, so there was just the two of us. So we kind of ended up doing more live role-playing for a very long time. And gaming's been wonderful in keeping us in touch with people we were at university with, and the live role-playing in particular. So we knew a lot of people from Treasure Trap, who knew a lot of people from Nottingham, which is how I know John Hodgson and have known him for 20-odd years, because he used to do Dark Ages live role-playing with Richard, my husband. We have one of John's earliest prints, because he was selling them out of the boot of his car at one of the events, and Rich bought it for me as a present when we were first going out. And it's still on the sitting room wall today. So mutual friends in common, and we got asked to go along to this Victorian live role-playing thing called Company of Crimson, which was written by our friends. And what we used to do was we used to take over a youth hostel for an entire weekend and do crazy Victorian Gothic steampunk thing influenced by the mythos. And that was great, because the first one we went to, they'd actually rigged the whole thing to do a fake seance with all the strings and the bells and everything. But it also had fairies and it also had ninjas. And I was NPCing, and I got to be a ninja maid, which was brilliant. That was one of the funniest moments I've ever had in live role-playing. It was a friend of ours who was a thoroughly sweet chap. He played a bumbling character called Lord Buffington. Terribly ever so British, terribly bumbling and apologetic, really, really great at playing that. And my maid had this secret grudge against him, for reasons I now can't remember. But she was being really strange, so he decided he would hypnotise her to try and, calm her down and sort all these problems out. And bless him, said the immortal words, "Channel all your anger into a fist." Bang. And me and the other person who was with me were trying desperately not to laugh because we knew this was about to happen, and he had no idea. So that was one of the funniest moments in gaming I've had. Was the look of surprise on this poor chap's face when he's trying to do this really sweet thing, and this tiny little maid just lamps him one and knocks him out. So we were doing a lot of that. We became involved. We got characters rather than going along to NPC. So I was Izzy. I was a big African game hunter who'd had to come home to Britain and be a proper lady, which she really couldn't cope with at all. because she was used to running wild in Africa and shooting things, which was quite handy, actually. So we used to do... It was a really strange thing. It was a very interactive campaign, so we used to do letter writing between events. Some of them we did as tabletop events because you just couldn't go anywhere to actually run them as live events, but we would also go off to various different things. And it had actually started where they'd all kind of fancied going to see a Gilbert and Sullivan production and decided they wanted to do it in costume. So they did, and the event actually grew out of that. So we went along, we had a whale of a time, we did that campaign, that lasted for at least 10 years, I think. All told, we weren't there for all of it. And then it became the 1920s campaign. And I said, can I play something different? I don't want to be a competent character this time. Can I be something incompetent? So I was a total airhead flapper that was obsessed with jewellery. So I got to get my bob wig out. And again, hiring youth hostels, going and doing various different things. So that campaign went on for a while. And that was an example of how you can use sound and lighting to create effects that big budget Hollywood movies normally require to do, you know. Because the final event of the 1920s event was supposedly taking place in deepest, darkest Africa. So not only was I playing my character from the 1920s, I also got to reprise Izzy as an old grouchy woman, which was fantastic. And we were walking through Epping Forest. We were staying at a scout camp in Epping Forest, and literally somebody was walking behind us with a ghetto blaster, playing jungle noises, which was seriously confusing all the dog walkers that we encountered. I was like, what? But it was amazing how much it helped you get into it. No, this isn't Epping Forest, this is actually Africa. It was fabulous. But then later on, obviously, you're in the Congo. We all know there's going to be dinosaurs, let's face it. Yes. Sorry, yes, of course. So, you know, there's going to be dinosaurs. It's deepest Africa. They're going to be there. So we thought, well, how on earth are they going to do this? So they had a big tent. We'd all been warned by the locals, don't go out after dark, it's dangerous, stay in your tent, it'll be fine. Again, the guy who played Lord Buffington was playing an NPC at this one. Bless him, uttered the most immortal lines of any character shortly before their death, which was, I'm just nipping out for a slash, which is to urinate. It's a euphemism for that. So he disappears out, and all we heard was, ah, from outside. And in the morning when we went out of the tent, we found sausages strung in a tree. But before that, we heard the footsteps. And we heard the noises. And we're all in this tent, because we've all seen Jurassic Park, we know we're not supposed to move. So we're all sitting in this tent, and they, bless them, they'd actually got glasses of water on the tables, and there were refs underneath the tables hitting them. So we were getting the, you know, the whole Jurassic Park water effect thing going off. And we're like, oh no, sit very still and don't make any noise. And then, as Jules' character went out to get killed, there was just this bucket of blood thrown at the tent. Only it was a very lightweight gazebo, and they hadn't realised it wasn't waterproof. So all the people that were sitting on that side of the tent got covered in fake blood because it just came straight through as if it wasn't there, which, you know, not great for costume, but very atmospheric. And because it's dark, we're in a tent, they managed to fizz rep the dinosaurs beautifully with light and sound. So they had a big cutout head of a T-Rex, they had the torches behind, and you could just see this thing stalking round the tent. And it's the quietest I've ever known gamers for a prolonged period, because we were literally sitting huddled, terrified that this thing was out there. So then we came out and found the sausages in the tree the next morning. So gaming can do wonderful things if you're prepared to buy into it and let your imagination run riot. And that was just such a tremendously impactful and emotive event, that one. And we'd had a few by that point, including sort of like characters having to kill people, their sister, because they were a vampire, you know, and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, we really knew how to go in for the emotional side of things rather than just running around the woods hitting things. So did that for a long, long time, and then started to come back into tabletop gaming. But because I'd done a lot of LARP, because my memory was, you know, not as good as it had been, and my brain works so that I will remember things in detail for as long as I need to know them, and then they're gone, because I need the space for other things. So the simplicity of live role-playing really appealed. And I couldn't cope with complex rule systems anymore. So we started to look at simpler rule systems. That was also about the same time that we started to do steampunk events. And a lot of that was because the friends that we'd made from the Victorian live role-playing had then moved into steampunk. And we went to the first big steampunk convention in Lincoln. Oh gosh, that's about 10, 11 years ago now. And there were a lot of cosplayers there who wanted to get into gaming. But they were really intimidated by the two systems that were out there, which was Victoriana and Airship Pirates. Can't speak for Airship Pirates, but Victoriana's a lovely game, but it isn't what I'd give to people who'd never role-played before. And I can say that because I edited the 3rd edition with Walt, who was a wonderful person. Walt Sichanowski, I think is how you say it, but I've probably just mangled that horribly. So I thought, no, I'm going to design a game that's nice and simple, pick up and play. You can play it anywhere. And the gag was that you could play it in your favourite tea shop with nothing more than a napkin and a sugar cube. Although we discovered later that British sugar cubes were no longer cube-shaped when we bought a box of them to hand out to people. They were like little flat shoe boxes. And like, well, that's not going to roll. So we bought lots of cola cubes. Do you have cola cubes here? Little cube-shaped sweeties that sort of almost taste like cola. Sort of like cola that somebody's had described to them but has never tasted, I think would probably be the best description. Filled with jelly in the middle. They're great. And I actually got food colouring pens, and before conventions, I used to sit and put all the dots on. And we would give them out. Up until the year that we were going over the cobbles at Lincoln, and the box fell out of the trolley, and they all ended up all over the cobbles, and I just thought, I'm not doing this again. That was hours of work, and it's just gone. The pigeons were very happy that day. They got lots of sugar, but nobody else did. So, okay, we've got this simple game. So we tested it at the asylum, which was what the convention was called, because it was literally run in the old asylum buildings at Lincoln, which the council had turned into a convention centre. Sadly, it's not held there anymore because it was closed down for refurbishment and never reopened. So I'd written Cogs and Cakes. I was quite happy with it. Had no idea how to market it really, so I used to sell it at conventions on a CD because that was way easier than trying to figure out how to publish it. Because print on demand was only really starting to come in at that point. But the other interesting thing was I was using it as a writing sample. And that's how I got the gig editing Victoriana 3rd edition, because I sent Cubicle 7 Cogs and Cakes to have a look at. And they said, oh, okay, yeah, you know what you're doing. Come do this, which I did. So that was really my first full gig back in the industry after this break. Now, from there, I ended up doing a little bit more on Victoriana, but I'd also sent Cogs and Cakes to Chris Birch, who'd set up Modiphius. And the reason I'd done that was because at Dragon Meet, which is another British convention, we'd been chatting to Sarah Newton. And they were just developing Acton Cthulhu at that point in time. And we'd, by that point, Company of Crimson had become League of Crimson for the 1920s, and then it became Codename Crimson for the 1940s, so we were all running around playing spies and goodness knows what in World War II. I was a land girl in that one, who actually ended up being turned into the Spirit of Britain. Somehow, I wasn't at that event, I was overseas, so I have no idea how I ended up basically doing a Delenn-style transformation in a giant egg. Which I'm kind of sad I missed that would have been quite fun. So we chatted to Sarah, going, oh yeah, no, we're looking for writers to do this World War II Call of Cthulhu thing. It's been a while since I've done Cthulhu, that would be nice. So I sent Cogs to Chris, and I was only ever supposed to be the researcher. Somebody else was supposed to write it, and then they dropped out. And it was like, okay, you're going to take it over. And it's like, yeah, it's only going to be 2 books. Won't it be embarrassing if we don't get the £8,000 on Kickstarter? 14 books later, and rather a large amount of money, it was like, oh, okay. So we were writing that while the Kickstarter was going on. I was set to edit it, doing all the fill-in writing. And that was one of those projects where everything that could go wrong kind of did go wrong, really, because we had a lot of bereavements. One of the main writers lost their mum. My dad died just as all the editing came in unexpectedly. As an only child, I then had to deal with the estate. So that, is like everything. So the fact that Acton Cthulhu exists at all is down to a very dedicated bunch of people who just kind of gritted their teeth and got on with it. Because we really did have a lot of problems. The Eastern Front source book was supposed to be written by a Russian team for a different game, and then we were just going to convert it. Only the project manager disappeared. It was discovered months later he'd actually decided that gaming was not going to be his life's work. He wanted to be a program manager, and he disappeared off to the Ural Mountains. He just hadn't told anybody. So his team were like, he's gone. Where's he gone? So that kind of had to be put together and start again from scratch. So we had a lot of technical issues, but it all came out in the end. And our core team on that was 4 people, basically. There was me. There was Michał Cross, who did all the layout and design stuff. Dave Bluer, who did the Savage Worlds conversions. And Dim Martin, our absolutely fabulous artist, who was actually a trained pharmacist, but decided he'd much rather do art instead. And thankfully, he did, because he was a fabulous artist, and I really enjoyed working with Dim. Because he could read minds. You didn't really need to give him an art brief. You just went, Dim, can I have something like this? And then this amazing picture would appear. It's like, yeah, that's awesome. I like that. So we were there. Obviously, we had a lot of freelance writers. We were all freelance ourselves. And we got those books out. And that was kind of a baptism of fire. Because I'd run projects as a research scientist on a much smaller scale. Thankfully, most of the people had already been lined up by the time I came in and took over. And I didn't have to worry about the money side of things, which was also great. But we got those books out. And then it came naturally to its end, and I was freelancing and doing various different bits and bobs for people. I'd done stuff for Cubicle 7, like I said. I'd done stuff for various other things. I did a bit of stuff for Chivalry and Sorcery, the previous edition. Which we were doing lots of live role-playing still. And then I was kind of like, well, what am I going to do? Where's the next job coming from? And then Mike Mason from Chaosium contacted me and said, can you start doing some things for us? I was like, okay, yes. Of course I'm going to do things for you, you're Chaosium. And again, that was an interesting one because Moon Design had literally just come in and taken over after all of Chaosium's problems with the Kickstarter. And the Modiphius booth at Gen Con was directly opposite the new Chaosium's booth, and I was too shy to go over and talk to them. And this was where Robin came in again, because Robin, being Canadian, is terribly polite, but also has some American qualities, he'll kill me for saying that, in the fact that he, if he wants something, he will go and say it. So I was route marched from the Pelgrane press stand to Chaosium, presented to Jeff Richards. Robin said something, just give her a job, basically. It's not quite that polite. And I was really shocked because Robin doesn't normally swear, and he said a rude word, and it was like, whoa. And that was kind of how I got the job at Chaosium, because Robin Laws told them to. Because every now and again, apparently, I need my career managing because I'm far too polite to do it myself. I'm learning, though. So there we go, start of a beautiful friendship. It's wonderful working with Mike and the people at Chaosium. But I demonstrated competence, which is a dangerous thing to do, which is how I ended up with the associate line editor's job. So mostly I was freelancing stuff. I stupidly volunteered to write another gigantic campaign solo. Having written Shadows of Atlantis for Acton Cthulhu, you'd think I'd have learnt by that point in time, but no. So I volunteered to do Children of Fear, allegedly based off the research notes I hadn't used for Shadows of Atlantis. Only I didn't, because I was looking at those notes, and I was doing bits of research to put the pitch together, and the history started to tell me what the campaign needed to be about. Which happens sometimes, which is really weird, because you start thinking it's going to be one thing, and then your research goes, no, you need to be doing this instead. So I thought, actually, that sounds quite cool, let's go do that. I'm not going to say too much, because it would kind of give the game away for players. So that involved a whole load more work. But it was also one of those projects that kind of get put on hold. So at the end, it took 4 years to write it, because Masks of Nyarlathotep happened in the middle. Now, that's the sort of project when someone says, do you want to work on the updated version of Masks of Nyarlathotep? You don't say no, because you're not going to get that opportunity again. So I never played it, but I knew its legendary status. So it's like, okay, let's do this. This is terrifying. but let's do this. And one of the reasons Mike brought me on with Scott Dorwood and Paul Fricker, both very safe pairs of hands, very excellent writers and creators, was because I didn't know the campaign. They'd all played it, they'd all run it, they had very rosy memories of it. I'd never played it. I'd read a couple of bits to make sure I wasn't stepping on its toes when I'd written Shadows of Atlantis, because it coincided with some of the locations. So I could come at it with a completely open mind and fresh set of eyes, and not fill in the gaps that were there because I'd had them filled in by either a keeper or as I was playing it. And I remember Mike going, it's only going to take a couple of months, we're just updating it to 7th edition. And I thought, it's not, you know. And as it turned out, it took a good bit longer. Because it's a very complex campaign for those of you who've read it and played it. The original campaign as well has huge leaps of logic in it, because that was the way you did things in 1984. A lot more was expected of your keeper to fill in those gaps, and it was just the way things were done. So we're reading through it going, okay, why do they go there? Or because they have to. Well, no, we kind of need a real reason why they go. So we had to go and do that. But of course, the whole point is it's a beloved campaign. You can't do too much to it because you don't want to spoil that thing that's made it special for 30-odd years. So you do have to be very careful because obviously we've got that legacy to honour, but we want to update it so that it's more accessible for new gamers and slightly less lethal, because let's face it, the original Masks of Nyarlathotep is a meat grinder. But thankfully, by that point, we had Pulp Cthulhu, which I love to bits. It's wonderful. Does everybody know what Pulp Cthulhu is? So, for those of you that don't, it's updating Call of Cthulhu to the 1930s. Your characters get double hit points, which means they survive slightly longer against the nasty, greebly things, but not a huge amount longer. And it's very fast-paced. It's your proper sort of Indiana Jones meets the mythos kind of thing, and it's a lot of fun. So what we did was we kept the original monster stats and everything for Pulp, and then we downgraded them slightly so that if you're playing classic Call of Cthulhu, you might actually live through more than one scenario with your investigator. Maybe. Depends if you're going to do stupid things. Because as we know, players love to do really stupid things you weren't expecting them to do. Bless them all. So it took a long time to get masks ready, to fill in those gaps, to explain those leaps of logic, to update the characters, to try and change the balance of characters as well. Because when I went through it, I did a little tally. Because, you know, trained scientists, I tend to do these things. There were about 113 characters, I think. 12 or 13 of them were women. 9 or 10 of whom were there purely to be sacrificed. That was literally all they did. They turned up, they were slaughtered to a god of some sort. It's like, no, that's ridiculous. It's 1920s, there's actually more women than there are men because, you know, World War I. We need to address this. We didn't quite get it to parity because it's a little bit tricky at times to do that, but we certainly introduced more women characters. We tried to get around some of the stereotypes. In its defence, Masks was very true to the pulp novels it was based on. But again, that's not really acceptable now. So we looked at that and we dealt with that, hopefully, sensitively. Because the thing is, Call of Cthulhu is a historical game. It's also got these fantastical mythos elements to it. But because it's a historical game, because it's set in our world, it really should reflect elements of our world, including the representation. So let's make sure that everyone who's playing it gets to see themselves in the game somewhere, because that's important, to see yourself in a game that's set in the real world. So that's something we're working very hard on, because we're aware that it's not always been something that we've achieved in the past. So Mask of Nyarlathotep was a big, big project, plus the fact we did the new chapter, the prequel. Because, of course, the whole point is you're supposed to be the good friends of Jackson Elias. You never actually meet him. So it's kind of like, oh, there's always that tricky bit. And I'm not going to say why you don't meet him. Those of you who've played it know. But we wanted to try and give you some investment in him at the start of the campaign. So Scott wrote a new chapter set in Peru where you get to meet the man himself. And that's all I'm going to say about it. So you have that investment for later on. It actually means something when he contacts you about what's going on. We were quite proud of that. We also built in a mechanism, which I'm also going to tell you too much about because it would kind of give the game away, so that if your characters do get killed, there's an excuse why you can bring in a new one, rather than just wandering around the corner and grabbing the nearest street urchin because your character's just been massacred by something. Which it kind of did get to at the point in the original version, because it was such a high death toll. It was like, oh gosh, who am I going to use to replace me? There's a waiter. He'll do. We've got no idea why he's suddenly involved because he's got no link to anybody other than he served them a drink 30 minutes ago. But he'll be fine. We'll bring him in. So hopefully we've dealt with that as well. So of course that was huge responsibility to do that lovingly, and I'm pretty pleased with how it came out. Actually, we all are. And of course, if you've seen it, it's huge, massive. So if you ever need to stun a rhino, if you need to prop open a door, or if you need to build a coffee table, you'll need probably about 4 of them, just to act as the legs. And it works very well for that because it's very sturdy. But we'd much rather you were actually playing it and enjoying it, but it does double as furniture if you're really stuck. So, of course, that was one of the things that helped get me the associate editor's job on the freelance basis for about 18 months. And then because I continued to display competence, they actually made that permanent, like I said, from the 1st of June. So that's now my day job. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, that's the wrong thing to say. Because I am now in an official management position, I now have to worry about contracts and things. So I'm having to learn all the paperwork stuff, which I always used to just let Mike worry about before. So most of June was actually writing contracts for the artists for Children of Fear, because there's going to be a lot of artwork, because that's going to be a big chunky book too. Not the size of Masks and Nyarlathotep, thankfully, but it's going to be big. You might need 8 of those to make a coffee table. So Children of Fear finally got finished, which was a relief, because although I'd enjoyed doing all the research and writing it, you kind of get to a point with projects that have gone on for years that you just want them gone. They have to be done so that you can move on, leave all that baggage behind and just keep going. So fingers crossed, next year that will be out. I'm getting some beautiful artwork in from our artists, and that's one of the other things. We are very blessed with fantastic artists, and I think all of you will agree who've been gaming for a long time, the quality of production in gaming has gone up massively over the last decade. Let's face it, a lot of the books that come out now are really coffee table art books as well as game books. So that puts a lot of expectations on a company, and good art is expensive, but they are things of beauty now. So if you need to buy 2 so that you can have one for display and then one to actually use, that's cool too, because that keeps paying my wages, which I appreciate very much. Thank you. So, I'm doing lots of editing now. I keep getting asked to do little bits and bobs for other people and other things, which is always fun. I like to make sure that I write a new convention game every year so that I am writing, not just editing, because I enjoy doing the research. And I enjoy writing stuff up and messing with people's minds, which is kind of a given if you're writing Call of Cthulhu. And like I said, gaming has been very, very kind to me. I've made wonderful friends, met my husband, and I get to come to fantastic places like this and meet all of you. So I have been to places I never thought I would get to. I've been to Seattle, been to 2 castles in Poland now, both this year. Here. Where else have I been interesting? All sorts of places. And I get to share my enthusiasm for role-playing with gamers and people who come to talks and things like that. And what we do is a wonderfully creative exercise. And I know a lot of people go, oh, I'm not creative. Yes, you are if you're a gamer, because you're helping build that shared world, that story that you're creating together. So everybody's creative if they're gaming, because it's not just my story because I set the framework up. It's our story that we build together. And I think that's sometimes things that people forget, that they're helping create that world and build that story too. So we're all creative people. And this is a very creative field. And it's wonderful to be a part of it. Whoa, I waffled on for quite a long time there. That's the lecturing training and the historical embroidery talk training coming in. So, you've all been very attentive. I do hope I haven't bored you stupid. Any questions? and I will stop moving. I tend to get very enthusiastic. When the guy from Finnish television was interviewing me earlier, I was trying to be terribly professional and stand here like this. And my hands were twitching behind my back because I speak a lot with my hands, as I'm sure you've noticed. So part way through, minute and a half in, it was like, no! So the hands started waving. So hopefully they're not whirling around too much on the thing. Questions? Anybody? Oh, right. Microphone time. Oh, it does work. Like you said, I can't throw that far and I'm really inaccurate. So you and then you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thanks for the Masks of Nyarlathotep. We're actually going through it right now. My question is related to some of the older classics on Call of Cthulhu. Like, I heard that Chaosium is also working on at the Mountains of Madness, like a similar edition to the Masks. And then also one of my favorites is the good old Tatters of the King. So would we be able to see a kind of new edition of that as well?
We are working through a lot of the old classics. I can't really tell you too many details, obviously, because they've not been announced. And the last thing we want to do is promise you things and then them not appear for 5 years. Because people get restive when you do that. You know, it's like, where's my cool stuff? It's like, there's other cool stuff, just not the cool stuff we told you about. Because things happen, like Masks of Nyarlathotep. So, yes, we are doing a lot of the old classics. Thank you. But what we're trying not to do is become the greatest hits company. We don't want to just put out previous things because we know the old gamers will collect them. Hopefully the new gamers will buy them too because they've never played them. But what we're trying to do is have a mix of new stuff and old stuff. So a lot of the classics, like I said, are in the pipeline, but they're a bit further on down the years. At the moment, a lot of the things I've been working on have been shorter scenarios, one-night scenarios and things so that we can support new players that don't have a group that can meet regularly so they can just do one-shots and things like that. Mike, I mean, one of the reasons I was brought on was so Mike can actually go off and do the big important things that need doing because, of course, running the line, he was doing all the paperwork stuff and didn't actually have time to write them and update them. So that's why I was brought in, basically, was so that he can go and do that, but I'm not allowed to tell you what. Otherwise, Cthulhu will probably rise from the deep and come and suck my face off, so... And I'd really rather he didn't, actually, because I really want to see Children of Fear in print, having spent 4 years writing it. So yes, things are coming. And when they're almost ready to drop, we will announce them so that you're not having to wait too long for them. I hope that answers your question.
The new edition of Masks is really good.
Thank you. Thank you. So, and a lot of that is due to Nick Nicario, who is our layout guy, Michal Cross, who designed the layout documents, and of course our wonderful artists who make it look so beautiful. I mean, writers are important too, kind of have to say that, and editors, but you know, without the artists to support it, you wouldn't have those absolutely beautiful products.
When you had any finished products come to your hand, have you noticed any memorable brain farts that go through editing?
Finished. You see, this was the really embarrassing thing when they asked, because I kind of, there's 2 of the 3 Finns that I know are in the audience here, and I know them from Kraken. Actually, technically, I know 4 because, axe throwing guy. Yeah, Risto's little boy from Kraken. So when they said, Finnish role-playing games, what do you know about them? It's like, oh dear. I think the
question was about finished products.
Finished.
I think products that are final.
Yeah. When you've edited a product and you get it in your hand, has there been any brain farts that got through that you didn't notice until it was finished?
Oh gosh, yes. Oh yes. Books don't get released; they escape into the wild. And I stole that from Dave Bluer. Because they do. Because the problem is, you spend so long working with things, you stop seeing problems. Your brain fills in those gaps, like we were saying with Masks of Nyarlathotep, the original one. You fill in the gaps because you need to. So you've spent months working on a project, And you think, yeah, no, we've got this, somebody else has proofread it, we've done this, we've done that, it's been through numerous hands, it'll be absolutely fine. And then it gets out there and you go, oh, how did we miss that? Mind you, it did take about a year for anyone to notice we actually had completely the wrong gun stats in one of the tables in the Acton Cthulhu Keeper's Guide, because that was a copy and paste error. But people don't check tables. And that's when you're proofreading things, you have to be really, really careful to make yourself check tables and stat blocks, because your brain just goes, no, it's fine, I don't need to worry about this, numbers. And that's usually where the mistakes creep in, because people's brains just go, it'll be all right, it's fine. Because I was quite impressed it took a year for anybody to notice, and then it was like, oh heck, how did we miss that? That's embarrassing. So yes, they do. They always do. Wrong page numbers, wrong stupid spellings, bits missed out, wrong stuff in a table, all sorts of weird and wonderful things we'll get through.
Any memorable one?
Yeah, that was the main one was the, oh, right, okay, that's not shotgun damage, that's actually machine gun damage. Oops. So that was definitely the worst one that I remember. Yeah, that's definitely the worst one. But thankfully, because we have PDFs, we can update PDFs and send them to people if they've bought them from us, because we know who's got them and we can keep those constant. And then when we do get to reprint, which is, sometimes thankfully we get to do, you can then update for the new print version. And of course, mistakes just make it more valuable. Honest. So, sorry I misheard the first time, I do apologise. Yes?
Are you planning on getting the Orient Express, the new edition of Orient Express, released as a sort of paperback for the general audience, not just those who participated in the Kickstarter?
Again, that is in the queue of the classic products that will be updated, but obviously because it was done quite recently and people bought it, we don't want to do it again too soon.
Oh.
But yes, it is going to, at some point, that will happen too. Anyone else? You can ask me anything, it doesn't have to be gaming. I can make stuff up. Gentleman behind you?
You said you have a very diverse field in gaming and gaming-related jobs. Is there anything different you've done? Like anything you've done a lot of editing, a lot of rules, something that you never thought you'd be doing in gaming industry?
I never thought I'd be working for Chaosium. That was one of those things, this is the big company that makes the games that I really like. And you don't think you're ever going to work for these iconic companies. So it's a real privilege and honour actually to have got to do that. And somebody actually said something really touching. I never knew Lynn Willis, I never met him. But someone actually said when it was announced, it's nice to have a Lynn back at Chaosium, which was... It was actually very touching, actually. So I hope I can do justice to his legacy, because obviously he was line manager for a very long time, and a lot of the very iconic stuff has Lynn's name on it. Different spelling, which causes mammoth confusion. I have 3 names that can all be spelt differently. So that tends to make for long phone conversations when people are asking you what your name is. Although marrying Rich, I did take his name because that bumped me way up the alphabetical list, so I get to do things sooner, because I was Wilson, was my maiden name, which was right at the back of the queue. Hardy, way nearer the front. It's good stuff. Right. I can see you've got the cube.
Hey Lynn, thank you for coming. And a question, who are your idols? Who do you look up to? Who are the inspirations in the field of gaming, role-playing, or productions, and so forth? You get the question. It's a broad question.
Oh, you can't. That's making me pick my favourite children. No, I can't do that. I have to work with these people. And they're going to be, why didn't you say me? Somebody actually asked me a similar question for an online thing I did the other day. It's like, who are your favourite British writers and gamers? Because it was about British writers and Irish writers, and no, I am not answering that question. I have to work with these people. There are a lot of people who have inspired me in different ways. I have been very fortunate to know and work with some tremendously talented people who have been very helpful to me in making sure that my career went forward. I've already mentioned Robin. Mike, Scott, Paul, Matt Sanderson. You know, I have found inspiration in some form from everyone I've worked with because they all have their own individual way of doing things. And that's an important thing to see and experience and share because there is no one right way of doing things. You can always learn from someone. We can always learn, no matter how old you are. You know, you can teach an old dog new tricks. You really can. Annie?
Yeah, so I have a question. Kind of, a lot of us have like a game we came kind of, that was the first love in a way. Kind of, some people it's D&D, others RuneQuest, for some it's Vampire, the Masquerade, whatever. Which, like, if you don't get to say like all the games you've played, which one is like, which is the first love, which is like the game that made you go, oh my god, this is like the best hobby?
That was Talislanta for me from a GMing point of view. I thoroughly enjoyed. I am going to say I love all the games. Most of the games I've played, not all of them. There's been one or two that haven't suited me. But I have obviously a very soft spot for RuneQuest because that was my introduction. Talislanta in terms of gaming because that was the first game I felt was mine and I could put my stamp on. And of course it was the game that got me into the industry. I thoroughly enjoy Call of Cthulhu just because, even though I'm terrified of horror films, and I can't read horror novels either because I get far too scared, but weirdly I can actually write really scary things. So I don't know what that says about me, but... So, yeah, there are a lot of games I have a soft spot for. I have a soft spot for Feng Shui because I got to play a really fighty character in that who actually had her bag of grenades confiscated by the other players because she couldn't throw for toffee. So she tended to blow them up. So that was always fun. Yeah, I've had the pleasure to play a lot of interesting games. I don't tend to get to play as much now, so it's always great fun to go to a convention where I can do gaming so that you can see what other people are doing. I have a semi-eidetic memory, so I do have to be careful when I'm working on things not to read too much of other people's stuff in case it accidentally ends up in things. So when I'm not working on projects that I'm writing, it's fun to go out and see what other people are doing. Because again, you see what people are doing, you learn tricks for yourself that can help you improve your game and your craft. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, gentleman behind you. Well done.
Cheers. Yeah, I was thinking, you were talking about your writing style and that you like to mess around with the players' heads a lot. That was said. And but still you like to keep things realistic in a sense, that
Yes.
like make things make sense. And sense making eventually leads into like they're having expectations in sense. And then the messing thing like subverts those expectations. So do you kind of like put a more of an emphasis on either of those? They kind of conflict. They do kind of conflict, I think. Or if they do, and like if there's a difference between the genres, like you do more emphasis on the other, on some genre, and something else about the other.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. It tends to come very naturalistic when I'm writing. Sometimes certain scenarios will go one way or another scenario will go a completely different way. And I listen to what the information is telling me and I tend to follow it. Because quite often when I'm writing, I'll have a plan and then I'll start writing and it'll decide it wants to go over there. So like, okay, let's do that instead. And that happens quite a bit actually. One of the things I quite often say at panels like this is it's much easier to sell the lie if it's rooted in reality. It's much more unnerving in a horror game if things are rooted in reality. Who's seen the original Weeping Angels episode of Doctor Who? Yeah. How creepy is that with the statues? Statues are all around us, they're incredibly mundane, you don't think twice about them, and then you shut your eyes and it's there. So having that realistic element there makes the strange much more terrifying because you understand it, you relate to it because it's something that's there all the time. You're aware of it, you're used to it, and then it does something strange and unexpected, which is frightening. The great thing about Call of Cthulhu is that you can do a little bit of metagaming if you're writing things for it, because people who've been playing it for a long time do have certain expectations. I like messing with those expectations, wrong-footing people so that they think it's going in one direction, then it's going somewhere else. So that's quite good fun. There's a couple of the convention scenarios I've done that, and they haven't been written up yet. Hopefully will be up at some point. But quite often it will develop naturalistically as the game is going along to which direction it's going to have more of. Terry Gilliam once said, and I think it might have been in either the documentary that went with Baron Munchausen or Killing Don Quixote, was that you can sell anything to an audience as long as it's internally consistent. So it can be as bizarre and as outrageous as possible, but as long as it is consistent with that world, people will buy into it, they will accept it. It's only if you break that people will start to look at it and analyse it and go, hang on, that's not right. So you can do a lot within a game world as long as you keep it consistent. And again, that's wonderful because it means we get to explore all sorts of different things, unnerving people, wrong-footing them, playing with their expectations and messing with their minds.
So basically the same ideas apply to high fantasy and D&D
yes,
as well as like anything else.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, is that you can apply these principles to any genre to keep things fresh, to keep things interesting and exciting. Because let's face it, there's only so many plots that you can do, and adding little tweaks to them to just freshen them up and make them a bit more lively again is quite good. So if you like fantasy, it's not going to hurt for you to go and have a look at, say, horror, because there might be something there that you can cherry pick and take over to your game to help refresh it for your players. Because, like I said, we can always learn from everything around us. You'd be surprised how much embroidery and textile stuff I keep sneaking in when nobody's looking, because there's interesting historical things that you can do with that people don't tend to think about. And that can help set the world up, because you're describing textures, colours, things that help do that world building. Because we're surrounded by textiles and textures all the time. And that can be very important. Smells, sounds, all that sort of thing to help enrich a game as well. So that when you do hit them with something unnerving, it stands out and it's obvious and it really sort of like, ooh, that's not right. Creepy.
All right, cheers.
Anyone else? Don't worry, I'm not going to make you stay here till 9:45 if we don't want to. I've been told we're allowed to leave early. Oh, we've got another one.
How much mechanical work have you done for games? As you say, you write a lot of world building and atmospheric building, but how much mechanical work do you do?
Quite a bit, actually. So I designed the system for Cogs and Cakes, which was a loving homage to the D6 system, and Ghostbusters and things like that, which are fabulous systems, very straightforward. But obviously, a lot of things with editing, you have to do a very technical edit. You have to check mechanics. You have to develop new rules for certain situations if they're not there. So while, personally I view my strength as the research side of thing and the writing side of thing, I'm also very good, because of my scientific training, at spotting things that don't follow, and mechanically as well, where there are gaps. So yes, it's surprising how much mechanical stuff I do end up doing. But again, it varies from project to project. Anyone else? Right. Well, if we have no more questions, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you very much. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Ropecon.